I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
I'm back for another edition of the Hillbilly Elegy Book Club. And in this edition, we are going to be talking about chapters 4 and 5 of J.D. Vance's 2016 book, Hillbilly Elegy. So chapter 4 deals more with what it was like to move to Middletown, Ohio from Kentucky, and what Middletown was like, and its sort of decline as a town, and the way that he grew up in a declining Ohio suburb, Middletown, as a kid, not really noticing the decline, or at least when noticing it, not realizing that it was having a direct impact on his own life and his own future, even though it was. But he talks about the things he does remember, like a tennis court becoming basically a cement block, quote, littered with grass patches. We've all seen those. Or the way there used to be 2 malls, and then one mall completely shut down, and malls become basically derelict. That's something we all recognize. He's talking about a strip mall there, a grocery store, the Kmart, and so on. All of that stuff that he experienced when he was a little kid had basically either been closed or was basically empty. He also talks about how there were these big houses and even a mansion, town after town, suburb after suburb in this country has these big, beautiful homes that have been basically just lived into the ground because people can't afford to keep them up, and they've been sold for less and less money over time. And so you have like people who are quite unable to keep them up but can afford to buy them, or as he says, people who bought them for when they were worth more money, and then as the whole area declines, they become worth less, and then they still have the debt and they can't move, which is a story that happens to towns everywhere where they rely on a particular industry or particular aspect of our economy, and then that economy or that industry is no longer really important, moves overseas, and then they're stuck with the remains that don't get kept up, don't get utilized appropriately, become dangerous, fall apart, become havens for homeless people. The big company for his family was something called Armco Steel, and he says in 1989, Armco consolidated or merged with Kawasaki, and the family grew to respect this, although it was kind of strange at first because it was a alliance, so to speak, between the American company and this Japanese company. The company had employed thousands of people, and it continued to employ a lot of people, including his dad. But at the same time, apparently, fewer and fewer employees were needed because the company was a global company, right? And it could get a lot of labor probably elsewhere. And over time, then that company didn't mean as much to the people in that town, and there were more companies like that. So obviously you get a picture of just slow death of a Midwestern suburb in the Rust Belt. So the people from Kentucky and Tennessee who had moved into Ohio to chase the industrial boom found themselves in this situation where the boom went from to bust, basically, which is a very typical story. This is the story of capitalism as a whole, is boom to bust, cycles of boom and bust, and industries coming and going, and typically accompanied with governments that don't really anticipate the economic and social problems that are likely to occur from these boom and bust cycles, regional dislocations, and all of the things that, all of the maladies that go along with that. They don't anticipate, and in fact, they encourage this type of industrial growth that's short-lived and where, people have to continue to retool or just be unemployed or underemployed. It's also the story of an economy that is de-skilling people at a faster rate, and coupled again with a government that just doesn't quite understand the ramifications, the gravity of this level of de-skilling and low wage, low skill employment. And, J.D. Vance doesn't say a whole lot about government policy in this chapter. That's, in general, in this book, that's not a big thing for him, one way or the other. All I'll say at this point is those changes that brought about the situation in Middletown, Ohio, and were aided and abetted by our government and its tax policies and regulatory policies and its diplomacy and so on, were pursued by Republicans and Democrats alike from 1980 onward, at least. I think I can very confidently say there hasn't been so much difference between the Republican and the Democratic Party on, say, corporate power, corporate influence, the attitude towards people who are more or less left in the dust by rapid change. This is something that I write about quite a bit in my book, which is going to be published pretty soon, The Gap in God's Country, because I think it's just extremely important for us to understand that our partisan politics have not really served us well, and that there hasn't been all that much difference between the two when it comes to this issue. In fact, I would say that most Democrats these days are pretty much the way moderate Republicans used to be. And therefore, and Republicans, I still believe, generally speaking, are very much in this camp as well, despite whatever rhetoric happens to be occurring around, as though, trade barriers are going to solve the problem that's been created by decades and decades of this type of government push towards economic growth at any price. I wouldn't believe it. I don't believe it. I urge you not to believe it. I don't think that, therefore, our two-party system has given us a lot of good choices for a long time, yet we seem kind of stuck. And that's partly why the Maurin Academy spends quite a bit of time on what else we can do that doesn't involve partisan politics. But I did want to point out, because J.D. Vance is running on the Republican ticket for vice president, that both parties have a legacy of creating this type of mess, not anticipating what needs to be done if you're going to have this kind of economic growth, or deciding to somehow limit growth by human concerns, such as creating strong families and community networks and actual happiness, okay, in people's lives. One of the things that comes out really clearly here is, these people were not happy, okay? He talks about how, the education system was terrible. About 20%, he says, of the high schools entering freshmen wouldn't make it to graduation. Geez, I went to a school that was worse on that statistic than he did, apparently. I don't think it was just 20%. Uh, he talks about how a truism at this point that everybody is the victim of this type of economic decline. Black people and people of color generally tend to come first in the United States on who pays the price first for economic decline, who's in the way, because they're kind of already, because of our history, they're on the lower rungs of our ladder of economic success in a lot of places. But then white people are not far behind, and everybody eventually, or at least a lot of people, end up suffering the same fate. So he recognizes that in this chapter. But instead of like spending more time on government policy and maybe giving us some clue of what he might have argued, 8 years later, now running for vice president, he spends more time on people's attitudes, their laziness, their lack of ambition, cultural factors. He talks about their patriarchal notions about labor getting in the way. He says that, many men considered women should only have women's work or not work at all. This did not help. These attitudes, and he does tie it back again to the Scotch-Irish migrants. Okay, so he spends quite a bit of time on that, which is consistent, right, with what he said previously, that there's something at work in his view within this culture, this people, that makes things worse when things are already challenging, that makes things worse. So he sees it as a cultural thing, and he does not see it as a epiphenomenal thing, that in other words, something that comes from this type of economic disarray. Okay. I don't think that's a really winning argument, as I've said before. I grew up in Rock Island, Illinois, so I know basically what J.D. Vance is talking about. Lived through it in my own area, similar issues in education. Saw a lot of, well, I don't think most of the people that I was around were Scotch-Irish, but I did see a lot of the same sort of behaviors out of people, both black and white, because and Hispanic, but less so. Those were the big three in our community. And so I never tied this stuff up with Scotch-Irish, even though I do have quite a bit of that in my own family background, because I grew up around all kinds of quote white people, lots of different shades of white. We still had a lot of ethnic identities amongst white people. The category of white is a little bit silly, but that is the way it is now, I suppose, as far as what in people's minds. Okay. Um, yeah. But he does note, on a positive note at the end of this chapter, he does say that in his own home, both with when he was at first living with his parents, and then later on, he'll talk more about his grandparents, but later on, for much of his growing up, he was around some adult or adults who actually cared about his education and development. But there was this pocket of time in between, decent times with his parents and having to live with his grandparents that was really quite traumatic. So then we move to chapter 5, where he starts out with his mom and sister, Lindsay, uh, telling him, picking him up from kindergarten and telling him uh, that he would never see his dad again. Okay. And then quickly he segues to his mom getting remarried to a guy named Don. Um, And that was a couple years after the divorce. And his dad gave him up for adoption when he turned 6 years old. So he relinquished any parental rights. Later on, his dad got remarried, had another couple of kids, and Vance felt replaced, which indeed he was, you know. And again, let's just say I've heard this story before. This did not happen in my own family. I come from an intact family. But I've known people that have had a very similar story in their own family. And it does indeed cause plenty of problems later on down the road in their lives to have this kind of background. Because, you know, when a kid has this experience, especially you know, this imposition of the stepfather right away, it feels like your parents don't really care about your long-term welfare, that you definitely come second, you know. Now, JD depicts his mom as pretty good during the early period of this new marriage. He says, quote, more than anyone else in my life, Mom wanted us to be exposed to people from all walks of life. Her friend Scott was a kind old gay man who she later told me died unexpectedly. She made me watch a movie about Ryan White, a boy that was not much older than I was, who had contracted HIV through a blood transfusion, because remember, this was the AIDS crisis era, and had to start a legal fight to return to school. Every time I complained about school, Mom reminded me of Ryan White and spoke about what a blessing it was to get an education. So obviously this was a woman, and she is depicted elsewhere in this chapter as really quite intelligent, which is probably partly where Vance's intelligence derives. Her intelligence, her native intelligence, and then also her respect for education. And so, you know, in fact, she got an associate's degree in nursing, and then she began working full time as a nurse. And he says that his mom was the smartest person that many people knew. Okay. So for a while, this was pretty good, but then there was fighting going on. Okay. And I don't get a clear sense on if there was always fighting, but you do get a clear sense that if there was, it remained at a much tolerable level. And then at a certain point, it started to escalate. Of course, before that, JD, you know, relays again his family's codes regarding fighting, you know, how you don't start a fight, but you finish it, how you, and he gets taught, and he details in this chapter how to fight if necessary. And he gets the message that if family pride is in the mix, that it still may be okay to start a fight, and so on and so forth. And then we move into this description of this more tumultuous period of time. There's more tension in the marriage, even though the income was good at this point. Nurse and a person who works at a factory getting paid relatively well. They were doing all right on that score, but the tension was there. And I can tell you that that happens because if people basically came from a chaotic background, you know, then they may be able to hold it together for a while, but then all that stuff that they learned when they were kids, it all comes right back out again. And it can turn people into different people. Okay. And that's what happened here. You know, suddenly they started really going downhill. And then the love, the sort of support that he had felt from his mom in particular, also started to go downhill as the, you know, mom and stepdad began to fight more and more. Then, you know, he got short shrift too. He says they spent a lot of money during this time while they're escalating their fights. And he says they bought a whole lot of things that they didn't need, quote, new cars, new trucks, a swimming pool. By the time their short marriage fell apart, they were tens of thousands of dollars in debt with nothing to show for it. If that isn't just, self-destruction, sort of like emotional implosion, I don't know what is. Plates were thrown. No, like stepdad hitting mom or the kids, at least not hitting mom first. Sounds like maybe some shoving and slapping and things like that, throwing things both directions. But he says he never hit the kids. But he began to start to have stomach aches. He started to exhibit the symptoms that a lot of kids do when they're living in this type of household, even though, they've known it their whole lives. At the same time, we are just not meant to deal with that much constant, stress and worry and violence. And then one day, Bob found out that JD's mom was having an affair and he demanded a divorce. And after about a month, they had moved back to Middletown and were staying with Mama and Papa. But then, and this is also extremely typical, I'm sorry to say, many of you probably can resonate with the same story. Mom then went into a real spiral, started having many boyfriends, sleepovers right in front of the kids, didn't matter, drinking a lot. Yep. Um, and then explosive temper. And he describes this one situation where she got mad at him while she was driving and she floors it. And then she eventually decides she's going to pull over and try to like beat him. And he jumps out and runs through a field to somebody's house, knocks on the door, and this good woman took him in and, shut the door and barred the door against his mom, who literally ends up beating the door down and grabbing him. But of course, the woman in the meantime had called 911 and the police came and arrested the mom. So I don't think he got hurt in this situation. But when your mom is literally like so enraged that she's not stopping, I mean, I can sort of imagine getting angry enough. I don't know, I never did get that angry, but I can imagine getting angry enough that you might floor your car and then pull over. Never did it. But yeah, I think we've all, momentarily lost it. But to sustain that through a whole run across a field and like beating down some stranger's door, that is truly extraordinary. And you wouldn't forget it as a kid. She got off, but hillbilly justice prevailed because basically at that point, JD earned the right to stay with his grandparents whenever he wanted to, and basically he stayed with them almost all the time. Now, I think we all need to realize that this level of pathology happens from generational trauma, right? Like, I'm not a psychologist, but I do study a lot of political psychology, and I've read my share of psychology articles on the passing on of familial trauma from one generation to another. It is generational, and so it tends to repeat itself. And so we all need to recognize that, if you come from this kind of background and you think, oh, that's going to change with me, like the movie that's on right now, right? It can, but you can't just will it to happen. Okay. This is an actual case for recognizing the problem early on and actually seeking help for it, because I truly believe there is no other way that you can prevent the cork from popping out of the bottle. Okay. And where does all this pain come from? It comes from generations of people that haven't lived well, that have lived precariously, that have been underserved by their society and their government, that have gotten terrible educations generation after generation. And all of that dysfunction, okay, builds up. And then people compensate by developing their own, dysfunctional cultural patterns to try to cope. And that's what hillbilly justice is, among other things. And like multiple serial marriages is another way of trying to cope as people reach out yet again, to try to find some stability, to find some happiness. But they don't have the tools, they don't have the equipment, they don't have the arsenal in at their disposal to make that happen. And so it just keeps failing. And then the kids of those parents or those people, um, they start the whole process all over again. If you are one of those people, consider not being overly confident of your ability to do this all on your own. So, thinking about these two chapters as a whole, I would say we've learned quite a bit about the lived experience of people in these types of families, in this type of situation. Um, and I think what's missing, and it's partly because it's a biography, but I suspect it's kind of missing in Vance too, is the notion that government policy, government priorities, because after all, the government represents our people, um, that their priorities moved away from and never really did embrace a lot of people who've made this country what it is, that a lot of people of all kinds that have like worked hard, including working for free, um, to build up all the things that other people have. All of that work, all of that labor without all that much reward, or in his parents' case, at the time they're starting to get some reward, so much damage has been done that they can't even handle it. They don't know what to do with it. But that's the result of generations of lack. So, I still think this is a good book. I read this book originally as in preparation for writing my own. I read a whole bunch of these kinds of books to get a feel for people's lived experiences in situations like this. And it's good at that level. But I really do think we need to stop this cycle. And it doesn't stop here with the individual. I think that's what we need to really let sink in. It doesn't stop here. It really does have to start at least halfway. Half of it has to start on the other end, society. Okay. Because if there are no social structures and supports in place or inadequate ones for people at the margins, people who are really hurting, or if the system is so screwed up that it actually causes more damage than it helps, then no amount of like economic prosperity and dreams of it is going to be able to solve the problem. Uh, we have to recognize that people need help, not just psychological help, okay, which is where we tend to go, not psychological help. For many people, they do need that. We need to change the way our economy works. Now, that may be, at least first, just a return to actually prioritizing labor. But at this point, what I can say is obviously something more needs to be done than simply sending the next generation off to therapy.